Just tell me what your name is.
My name is Fountain Hughes. I was born in Charlottesville, Virginia. My grandfather belonged to Thomas Jefferson. My grandfather was 115 years old when he died. And now I am 101 years old.
The roots of institutional racism in the United States run deep. They can be traced back to the time when European settlers first arrived in North America, establishing colonies and bringing with them enslaved people from Africa. In 1676, Nathaniel Bacon, an affluent Virginia planter, frustrated by the scarcity of land available for settlers, sought to expand into territories belonging to indigenous people. Though he had repeatedly petitioned the colonial governor to seize the land of their peaceful indigenous neighbors, he was denied each time. So Bacon assembled a militia composed of individuals from various backgrounds, African and European indentured servants, enslaved workers, and formerly enslaved people, as well as indigenous people. United under Bacon's command, they marched on Jamestown, the colonial capital, and set the city ablaze. They actually burned down the governor's mansion. The event came to be known as Bacon's Rebellion. Although it ultimately failed, the rebellion represented a pivotal moment in the history of race relations in the United States. After the uprising, alarmed wealthy planters, fearful of losing power, particularly to an alliance of black and white farm workers, instituted colonial laws granting certain privileges we now associate with citizenship to European colonists, while subjecting Africans to perpetual generational enslavement. This newly established caste system further stratified society along racial lines, introducing the terms black and white into the lexicon of 17th century America. The concept of white identity was born. Since English law didn't define or even recognize slavery, it's safe to say that wealthy Virginians had invented something utterly new, an institution that ensured access to cheap agricultural labor for generations to come. And to ensure its survival, wealthy landowners made as sharp a distinction as they could between enslaved Africans and the white indentured servants who worked alongside them. White indentured servants continued to be exploited, but they retained the ability to fulfill their obligation to servitude and gain the freedoms associated with membership in society. Rather than advocate for the freedom of their African co-workers, white indentured servants and poor white people focused on laying claim to their newfound status, prioritizing distinguishing themselves from black people at any cost. The planters' spot at the top of colonial society was now cemented. Their solution and the legacy was an institution that reduced human beings to property, ensuring people of African ancestry occupied that status for centuries to come. The inhumane institution of slavery, marked by brutality, rape, and the destruction of families, was central to the launch of the US economy long before America existed. Agricultural products were the top exports from the colonies, and later from the newly formed United States. The production of these cash crops relied entirely on the labor of enslaved people. Furthermore, the textile manufacturing and banking sectors in the South were also established and sustained through the use, financing, and insuring of slave labor. Slavery was also a significant factor contributing to the population growth of the Southern colonies in the 18th century. Enslaved people comprised less than 10% of the Southern population in 1680, but by 1790, their numbers had increased to almost 700,000, or 17%. And by 1860, the enslaved population in the Southern states had reached almost 4 million, which was nearly 1/3 of the South's population. The economics of cotton production was the driver of this population explosion. Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin in 1793 changed the game, making it incredibly more efficient to process raw cotton. The resulting disruption of the textile industry drastically increased the demand for and demands on enslaved workers. To take advantage of the increased production capacity, planters purchased more enslaved people. When demand for cotton outstripped the supply, plantation owners and their overseers ramped up the daily quotas, along with violence in the cotton fields, to close the gap. In 1801, each enslaved worker picked an average of 28 pounds of cotton a day. By 1840, the figure was as high as 341 pounds. Impossible quotas were thrust upon the enslaved, with beatings, torture, and starvation as brutal incentives to make their numbers. In a classic catch-22 situation, enslaved workers who met their quotas had them increased, and those who failed were punished. The cycle was vicious. In South Carolina, terrorizing the enslaved included whipping, branding, dismembering, castrating, and killing, which was legal under many circumstances. It is crucial to acknowledge that enslaved people did not passively accept their fate. From the very inception of slavery in the United States, there were rebellions against the enslavers. Even though the revolts were often met with crushing force and seemed doomed from the start, many enslaved individuals took up arms against their captors, displaying unwavering courage throughout this long and brutal chapter of American history. Defying the stereotype of docile servants, they demonstrated an indomitable will to pursue freedom, even in the face of near certain death. The timeline of slave revolts in the United States includes the Servants' Plot, 1663, Virginia, 4 or more executed. The Stono Rebellion, 1739, South Carolina, 44 executed. The New York City Conspiracy, 1741, over 100 executed or otherwise punished. The German Coast Uprising, 1811, at least 84 killed in battle or executed. Denmark VC's Revolt, 1822, 35 executed. Nat Turner's Revolt, 1831, 30 executed. The Harper's Ferry Raid, 1859, 5 executed. Despite the fierce resistance and violence required to maintain this unjust system, Southern planters continued to invest heavily in chattel slavery. Why? Because it was immensely lucrative. Wealth in the South soared during slavery, particularly in the Mississippi Delta, which boasted the highest number of millionaires per capita in the U.S. In 1860, just prior to the Civil War, the South produced almost 75% of all U.S. exports and nearly 70% of the world's cotton supply. As assets, enslaved people were worth more than all the manufacturing companies and railroads in the country. Enslaved people classified as chattel and treated as movable property were distinctive commodities, functioning as both free labor and legal tender. Slavery's impact on the U.S. economy extended beyond the South. Documents expose connections between specific financial institutions, including insurance companies and banks, some of which remain in existence today. Both Citizens Bank and Canal Bank, which were antecedent banks to J.P. Morgan Chase and Company, allowed enslaved people to be put up as collateral for loans. If the borrower defaulted, the banks assumed ownership of the collateral. Other institutions, including insurers, manufacturers, and transportation companies that profited from slavery, are too numerous to mention. The South's investment in slave labor would reach $3 billion, equaling roughly $97 billion in today's dollars, and accounting for 12 to 15% of the entire nation's real wealth. When Abraham Lincoln, who opposed the expansion of slavery, was elected to his first term in office in 1860, the South perceived the new administration as an existential threat to their booming agrarian economy and way of life. In response, South Carolina seceded from the Union on December 20th, 1860, being the first to cut ties with Washington. In the months following, 10 additional Southern states followed suit. and the Confederate States of America was born. The Confederacy claimed states' rights and pro-slavery interests as justification for their secession. No elite class in history has ever given up such an immense interest voluntarily. So it's not surprising that in 1861, the newly formed Confederate Army attacked Fort Sumter, marking the beginning of the Civil War. It's important to understand that the North did not go to war to free enslaved people, but to preserve the Union. As Lincoln bluntly put it, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do that. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would do that." Lincoln's priorities and pragmatism were reflected in the Emancipation Proclamation. The proclamation was less a moral statement than a military tactic. It did not free all slaves, only slaves residing in states that were in open rebellion against the Union. As the fighting dragged on, Lincoln had become convinced that the only way to defeat the South was by waging total war. The Emancipation Proclamation was part of that strategy. By attacking one of the South's most important economic assets, Lincoln hoped to bring the conflict to a speedy conclusion. The war did not end as quickly as Lincoln hoped. 600,000 casualties later, the brutal conflict came to a close in 1865 with the Union's victory. The ratification of the 13th Amendment 6 months later, after the war ended, abolished slavery. But the fate of the 4 million newly freed Black people living in the United States was far from clear. Most white Northerners assumed that free Black people would work as paid agricultural laborers in the South or leave the country altogether. Very few believed in racial equality, and most did not want Black people coming north. A number of northern states had laws barring Black people from settling within their borders. Southerners, both Black and white, surveyed the devastation and destruction the war had produced and wondered what would come next.